I'm going to share a simple yet powerful image with you. And by the end of this video, once I have explained everything this image has to offer, you will have a very concrete understanding of how to learn a language. This image is so powerful, in fact, that it took me 20 whole minutes in Photoshop to create. Are you ready to see it? Here it is. Now, what are we even looking at? This, my friend, is an incredibly simplified diagram of how we learn languages as humans. And even if you've seen these words before, which if you're watching this video, chances are you probably have, just give me a few minutes of your time and I promise I'll completely change the way that you look at these things. If you're only going to remember one thing from this video, remember this. Language is one giant feedback loop. Whether we're babies mumbling our first words to adults formulating complex academic arguments and dissertations, we all learn languages in a way that follow this image. It may not look like much right now, but as we will see, navigating all the different steps within the feedback loop and understanding how they relate to one another can become quite involved. However, by understanding how each step in the feedback loop works and how it reinforces and relates to all other steps, we will gain a solid foundational understanding of how to learn, which is crucial when learning languages. And at the end of the video, I'm even going to share with you a way that you can transcend this loop altogether to become a truly dangerous language learner. Let's look at step one. Input. Input or input learning is the very backbone of language learning and has to do with anything that you take in using your senses. It's usually done through reading and listening, but hey, if you can find a way to smell, taste, or touch your target language, then more power to you. You're probably on the brink of a breakthrough. But anyway, this is where everybody starts their language learning journey. And as I'm sure you already know, it can range from watching TV shows and movies to listening to music and podcasts and everything in between. If you can sense it and understand it, it's considered input. I prefer to think of this point in the feedback loop as the accumulation phase, because when we first start learning languages, most of our learning occurs in the later part of the loop, which we'll talk about shortly. It's not that you can't learn things from input learning alone, but when you really don't know what you're doing, you're probably not going to get too much out of it, and if you don't know how to review or maintain it effectively, you're going to lose it pretty quickly. So remember just a little while back how I was talking about input is anything that you can sense and understand? Well, this is where comprehensible input comes in. You've probably heard this term thrown around quite a bit on the internet. You see, we can't just throw on a news report in Mandarin and try to translate everything as it's being said to us back at lightning speed. We simply won't learn anything. What we acquire from our target language must be appropriate for the level that we're at. That is to say, if you get thrown into the ocean without learning how to swim first, you're gonna drown. A good rule of thumb for getting the most out of your input sessions is to shoot for 85% to 95% comprehension. Now, you may think that's too high and are okay with listening to stuff that's a lot higher above your current proficiency level because you overestimate your ability. I've definitely fallen into that trap myself. But just think about how little you'd be able to comprehend if just a few key words were omitted from any given sentence. Let's look at some examples. Here's an example of a sentence with a 60% comprehension rate. Now, if this were a real conversation, you'd have absolutely no idea what I was talking about, and you likely wouldn't be able to find out without asking way too many questions and forgetting what the sentence was in the first place. 60% is simply not enough, so let's look at 70%. Now here's the same sentence with another keyword thrown in. As you can see, we have a little more to go off of than before, but we're still missing many pieces of critical information. And we'd have to ask at least 3 questions to understand the full thing. When, where, and to get some what. And trust me, trying to read and listen to something while only understanding 70% is not a good time. So let's look at 80%. All right, now we're talking. Now we probably have some idea about what is going on. We're still lacking a lot of context, but we're not completely lost anymore. This level of understanding isn't exactly comfortable, but it doesn't feel like we're drowning either, which is why it's just slightly off of the rule of thumb of 85%. It may take a bit of questioning and inquiring on our part, but we'd generally be able to understand people when they're speaking in their native language. However, from a learning perspective, it's still not quite enough. After all, stopping to look up 2 unique words every sentence still sounds like a lot of work, right? So let's look at 90%. Now this is where you want to be. This is what your language lessons should sound like to you if you want to learn in the fastest way possible. While we still don't understand everything, we can very easily fill in the blanks with the addition of context. And even if that context is lacking, it only takes 1 question maximum for us to understand the entire sentence. Now this is the full sentence, just in case you're wondering. Pretty mundane, I know, but it was just to illustrate the concept of why this rule of thumb of 85 to 95% of comprehension exists. Now I know what you're thinking, Cole, how in the Steve Kaufman will I be able to shoot for 85 to 95% if I don't know any words yet? And that's a really fair question. And again, it all comes back to the feedback loop. Language is a continuous process of making sense what you're bringing in, input, applying it in order to communicate with others, output, and then getting feedback on what you said so you never make the same mistake twice. This realization that you messed up, funnily enough, is where almost all of the actual learning happens. Because you don't get validated on what you're learning through input until you can effectively communicate it with output. I've seen a lot of people fall into this trap of focusing only on input learning, which I used to do before, I'll be honest, developing really bad habits early on and then struggling to break them as they became more and more advanced. Well, to answer that question of starting from zero, let's take a look at what exactly we should do after we add a few new words to our repertoire. Output. Output is the tool through which we seek to realize the language goal that we all likely have, to speak well. Just like we have to crawl before we walk and walk before we run, we have to contend with speaking poorly before we can speak well. Fortunately, getting better at things like speaking and writing is extraordinarily simple. You just gotta do it. But how you do it is the thing that matters the most. You see, speaking well is not only a matter of getting your reps in, but also learning how to do things like stop translating in our heads and to be able to use language in this spontaneous, intuitive way. While purposeful, deliberate practice is definitely the way forward here, there are a variety of different personalized methods one can use to get there faster. As we will see, regular and consistent speaking and/or writing sessions play a large role in how much information we remember and how much we can ultimately use in any given conversation. Here's a bit of a thought experiment to drive that point home. How many words do you know? Out of the thousands upon thousands of hours that you've had in your native language, how many words do you think you've ultimately internalized? While this is a hotly debated topic among linguists and language professors alike, there's a general consensus that any given adult native speaker knows about 10,000 words minimum. And for some people, this number may be well over 30,000, which is so interesting because we only utilize a fraction of them in our everyday interactions. Well, why is that? It's because long-term memory and recall are two different faculties in the brain. It's not that you don't know the other words, it's just that they're likely rusty and thus less probabilistic that your brain will serve them to you on a silver platter during an everyday conversation. So if we're trying to acquire a new language, regular output sessions can be instrumental in not only strengthening existing words we've already studied, but also exposing us to new yet understandable words spoken to us by interlocutors. This is an essential step in the language learning process that many people miss out on because they're simply afraid to go out there and speak. But I'm telling you, people are not that scary. As someone who suffered from crippling social anxiety for so many years, and to this day, to a certain extent, I can with complete certainty tell you that people are not as scary as they seem, and in fact are your greatest and most meaningful tool to understanding a new language. And all that stuff is on top of enabling us to put what we've learned from our input sessions into practice. This is how output is related to input. So now that we've gathered some words, formulated our first sentences in our heads, and practiced them with others, what does the almighty feedback loop say to do next? Feedback. Like I touched upon before, this is where the real learning happens. Because when we start off learning a language, we simply don't know what we don't know. And assuming that we know more than we actually do can lead to a lot of problems later down the road. Which means to learn optimally, we ultimately need some sort of feedback from someone or something, now that this fucking AI thing is around, that knows more than we do. Luckily, with the plethora of language exchange websites readily available to you, coupled with the really exciting advent of artificial intelligence, it has never been easier to get feedback on your learning. The goal here is to have as many aha moments as possible, and we do that by asking questions and making mistakes. You know those moments when something just clicks in your head and you understand it for the first time and it makes complete sense? That is what you should be pursuing here. And I highly encourage you to try to express yourself in a way that's just slightly outside of your comfort zone, at least while you're practicing. This way you'll be expanding your ability to communicate every single time you practice and getting yourself one step closer to fluency. So after receiving, reflecting on, and internalizing the feedback you're given, the only thing left to do is to go back to your input learning and start the whole process over again. But like I said at the beginning of the video, there's actually a way that you can transcend this loop altogether to become a truly dangerously effective language learner. You see, once you reach a certain level of language proficiency, it becomes massively easier to learn new words and phrases. You will literally find yourself learning more in the same amount of time with no extra effort on your part, just because you reached a certain level of autonomy. This usually occurs at around the high intermediate B2 level, which if you're not sure what that means, check out this video somewhere in the corner. I made a video about that a long time ago. It was like my third video I ever made. You will become so knowledgeable, in fact, that you will be able to notice and correct your own mistakes right after you make them. And this is the exact definition of general fluency. So what does this mean for the almighty loop? Well, instead of having to go through that process of input, output, feedback, learning, and then back to input, you will be able to have those crucial, critical aha moments at every step of the process. And once you get there, you will have it for life. The feedback loop forever changes. And it now looks something like this. This is the loop of the intermediate learner. Once you reach this point, you will have transcended the feedback loop. Once you reach this point, everything becomes marginally easier than it ever was before. This is the optimal path through which you can learn any language in the fastest way possible. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I read them all. I'm here to help, truly. I wish you all good luck on your language learning endeavors, and I hope to see you in the next video. Peace.